Subcommittee will come to order, and without objection, the chair will be authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Hearing none, so ordered. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Since the 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has experienced a dramatic growth in its prison population. The number of inmates under the BOP's jurisdiction has increased from approximately 25,000 in fiscal 80 to over 216,000 today. Since 1980, the federal prison population has increased on average by approximately 5,900 inmates each year. The increasing number of federal inmates contributes to overcrowding in the federal prison system. Overall, the federal prison system was 36% over its capacity in 2013. The problem, however, is particularly acute in high and medium security male facilities, which operate at 52% and 45% respectively overrated capacity. The inmate-to-staff ratio has increased from 4.1 inmates per staff member in 2000 to 4.8 inmates per staff member last year. This overcrowding leads to inmate misconduct and creates safety issues for both inmates and corrections officers. Due to increased available bed space, wardens have resorted to double bunking and converting shared recreational space to house inmates, among other things. The overcrowding also affects the availability of rehabilitation programs for inmates, including substance abuse treatment. There should not be waiting lists for these key programs that help address recidivism. BOP's budget has similarly grown dramatically in recent years. Today, with an appropriation of more than $6.8 billion, the federal prison system accounts for 25% of the Justice Department's budget. The cost to house each inmate has increased over time, going from $21,000 in fiscal year 2000 to $29,000 in fiscal 2013. This means that the cost of running federal prisons will continue to increase quite dramatically, even if no new inmates are added to the system. The federal government is not alone in facing an overburdened correctional system. The states have struggled with similar issues in recent years. While the number of prison inmates across the country has been slowly decreasing since 2008, as of 2012, there were still over 2 million people incarcerated in prisons or jails nationwide, and the cost of incarceration has increased in the states. In 2012 alone, the states collectively spent more than $51 billion on corrections. Each of the states faces unique challenges that drive prison costs and overcrowding, but it is commonly accepted that high rates of recidivism greatly contribute to these problems in both the state and federal levels. A number of states and localities have taken innovative approaches to managing prison growth and recidivism through the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, a program done in conjunction with the Justice Department and several nonprofit partners. Through this initiative, participating states and localities conduct a comprehensive analysis of the jurisdiction's criminal justice data, identify drivers of corrections, populations, and cost, then help to adopt appropriate policy changes to address prison growth, recidivism, and cost controls without compromising public safety. The participating states are at various stages of the process, and broad reform cannot clearly happen overnight. However, a January 2014 report on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative found that the savings from implementing the initiative could save participating states as much as $4.6 billion over 10 years by helping to ensure that fewer inmates endlessly cycle in and out of prison. This is encouraging news. Today we have before us a distinguished panel of witnesses to share how different states are tackling prison reform responsibly and effectively, and hopefully how some of these reforms might be translated into the federal system. And we're honored to have all of you here today. It is now my pleasure to recognize for his opening statement the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we have too many people in jails and prisons in America today. The Pew Center on States estimates that for any incarceration rate over 350 locked up today for every 100,000 in population, the crime reduction value begins to diminish, because at that point you certainly have all of the dangerous people locked up. Pew's research also tells us that any rate above 500 locked up today for every 100,000 population, the rate becomes counterproductive, meaning that it generates more crime than it stops. That's because unnecessary locking up people wastes money that could be put to better use. Families are disrupted, making the next generation more likely to commit crimes, and too many people are suffering from the collateral consequences of felony convictions, making their legal job prospects dim. Most countries lock up between 50 and 200 per 100,000, but as a result of emotionally appealing tough-on-crime slogans and sound bites, the United States incarceration rate not only exceeds 500 per 100,000, it leads the world at over 700 per 100,000 in jails and prison today. Research shows over 500 is counterproductive, and we're at 700 per 100,000, and some minority populations are locked up in the thousands. Furthermore, our correctional institutions fail to correct. More than 4 out of 10 adult American offenders are right back in prison within 3 years of their release. So it has become apparent to many policymakers that the status quo is not sustainable. If the crime policy, certainly because of the crime policy, but certainly because of the expense. And as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, we're wasting billions of dollars. This waste is particularly egregious because we know that alternatives can reduce crime and save money. These alternatives include so-called back-end solutions, appropriately dealing with people who have committed crimes, and front-end solutions, evidence-based prevention and early intervention programs which can avoid crime being committed in the first place. The back-end solutions include drug courts and alternatives to incarceration, such as home monitoring, which are less expensive than incarceration and more effective in reducing recidivism, and at sentencing, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences and other excessively long sentences. Mandatory minimums have been studied and shown not only to waste money, but also do nothing to reduce crime. And rehabilitation programs such as drug treatment, education, job readiness in prisons, all have been proven to effectively reduce crime, and most save more money than they cost. Today's hearing, we will focus on what can be done on the back end, that is, after a person is convicted, but we should also not ignore the cost-effective initiatives that get young people out of what the Children's Defense Fund calls the cradle-to-prison pipeline and into a cradle-to-college and career pipeline with comprehensive, evidence-based, locally tailored strategies which significantly reduce crime and save money. So I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, all of whom have made significant progress in solving the problem, not only by reducing crime, but also saving money, and then reinvesting that money into initiatives that will reduce crime even more and save even more money. I also look forward, Mr. Chairman, to working with you in dealing with cost-effective, evidence-based strategies that can, in fact, reduce crime and save money. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Let me introduce our witnesses. Before doing that, without objection, all members' opening statements will be placed in the record at this point. The first witness is the Honorable Cam Ward, who is an Alabama State Senator, first elected in 2010. In his first term as State Senator, he was appointed as Chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mr. Ward chairs the Joint Legislative Prison Committee and is Chairman of the Alabama Prison Reform Task Force created in 2014 during its legislative session to study prison overcrowding. Mr. Ward also served 2 terms in the Alabama House of Representatives. He was previously appointed Deputy Attorney General for the state of Alabama, worked as an Assistant Secretary of State where he dealt with election laws and corporate filings, and was also a district director for Congressman Spencer Burns, who is a member, Spencer Backus, who is a member of the subcommittee. He received his bachelor's degree from Troy University and his Juris Doctor from the Cumberland School of Law. The Honorable John E. Wetzel is the Secretary of Corrections for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Since his appointment in 2010, Mr. Wetzel has presided over the first population reduction in Pennsylvania in over 4 decades. Additionally, he has overseen the restructuring of the community correction system, the mental health system, and a re-engineering of internal processes to yield a more efficient system of program delivery. He began his career in Lebanon County as a correction officer, treatment supervisor, and training academy director. He also served a 9-year tenure as warden of the Franklin County Jail. Under his leadership, Franklin County saw a 20% reduction in its population while the crime rate declined. He was then appointed to the Pennsylvania Board of Pardons as the board's correction expert. He is a member of Harvard's Executive Session on Community Corrections, which is a joint project of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government and the National Institute of Justice. He received his Bachelor of Arts from Bloomsburg University and has done master's level coursework in applied psychology at Penn State University. Mr. Jerry Mabin has served 10 terms in the Texas legislature, where he has served as chairman of the Committee on Corrections as well as a member of the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee. He headed Texas's 2007 Criminal Justice System Reforms legislative initiative, which sought to divert individuals from prison through mental health and substance abuse treatment programs, provide more opportunities in prison for rehabilitation, and properly utilize probation and parole mechanisms to avoid greater costs if new prisons were built. In 2010, he was appointed to serve on the Texas State Council for Interstate Adult Offender Supervision and was named co-chair of the National Conference of State Legislators Sentencing and Corrections Work Group. After completing his legislative career in 2013, Mr. Mabin was named a Senior Fellow for the Right on Crime at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where he serves today. He received his bachelor's degree from West Point Academy and his Master of Science degree from the University of Texas at Dallas. Now, Dr. Nancy C. Levine, and I probably mispronounced it.
It's Lavine.
Lavine, okay, is director of the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she oversees a research portfolio of projects spanning a wide variety of crime justice and public safety topics. Before being appointed as director, Dr. Levine served as a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, directing research on prisoner reentry, crime prevention, and the evaluation of criminal justice technologies. Prior to joining the Urban Institute, Dr. Levine was the founding director at the Crime Mapping Research Center at the National Institute of Justice. She later served as special assistant to the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs within DOJ. She has also held positions as research director for the Texas Sentencing Commission, research fellow at the Police Executive Research Forum, and consultant to the National Council on Crime and Delinquency. Dr. Levine received her bachelor's degree from Smith College, her master's degree from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and her doctorate from the State University of New Jersey. We ask that all of you limit your comments to 5 minutes. I think you know what the red, yellow, and green lights mean. And without objection, all of your written statements will be placed in the record prior to your testimony. Senator Ward, you are first.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you today on a very serious issue that's facing Alabama. My comments come from a unique position in that my state would be what you would call a failed correction system. However, these challenges have forced us to take advantage of many opportunities that we know are proven and available to us if we have the political will and courage to take them on. We had the highest incarceration rate in the United States today at 192%. Our prison system is more overcrowded than almost any other country in the world. But we also had the 8th highest crime rate. That tells us one thing: locking them up and throwing away the key is not a solution to our problem. In order to reach a capacity of 137% overcrowding, we would have to spend nearly $600 million to build our way out of this problem. That would be over half of our entire general fund for the state of Alabama. Not only is that not feasible, that's fiscally irresponsible and morally unacceptable. Today in Alabama, we spend $42.50 a day per inmate that we put in incarceration. In order to reach the same level by our neighbors of Florida and Georgia, we would have to increase spending per inmate by 20%. Due to the recession and other fiscal restraints, that's just not feasible either. So what do? In my 12 years of public service, I can tell you I've rarely seen an issue that generates more bipartisan support than this particular issue does. Faced with this problem, a bipartisan effort was initiated this past spring, launched with the Justice Reinvestment Initiative in Alabama. This spring, the legislature created the Alabama Prison Task Force, and the leaders of all three branches of government came together, which is rare, by the way, to support this 25-member coalition to bring about new changes in Alabama's prison system. Governor Bentley named me chairman of this group, and immediately we went about creating a diverse organization that both includes prosecutors, victims' rights advocates, as well as inmates' rights advocates. This group has started working, and right away we've seen what other states have done that can make a true difference in Alabama. Recent states that have taken on the Justice Reform Initiative have seen a drop by nearly 8% in their prison population, with almost no crime increases. Over the years, Alabama, like many states, have passed enhanced sentences for different crimes. We've limited parole for nonviolent offenders and refused to amend or update our Habitual Offender Act. This has created the problem we're in today. We have stuck our head in the sand and act like it didn't exist when every day it was right there in front of us. We no longer have that opportunity. However, there is a roadmap forward that shows what we can do to fix this problem. There has been proven success stories, and there are several examples of what we can do. For example, our disjointed sentencing guidelines have varied greatly between circuits and counties. The Sentencing Commission, created very similar to what you have on the federal level in Alabama in 2000, has come up with a model for presumptive guidelines that will now make sure there's more uniformity in how sentencing is carried out. We've had more data sharing opportunities between the various criminal justice organizations in Alabama to show which criminals or which offenders should be put in for a longer period of time, which should be released earlier, and which may be qualified for alternative sentencing programs. At the end of the day, though, as I tell my colleagues every day, money is not going to be the solution alone. There has to be alternative sentencing programs available for the people of Alabama. Community corrections, which helps reduce recidivism and increase the productivity of an inmate once they leave the custody of the state system. Drug courts, mental health courts, and now veterans courts offer us an opportunity to not only reduce recidivism, but do it for a third of the cost. Community corrections in Alabama exist in 48 counties. My goal would be to expand that to all 67 counties, make it a uniform process. Currently today, 3,700 inmates who would be prison bound are currently in community correction programs. What's the difference? In community corrections, we spend $11.50 a day. To put someone in prison, as I mentioned before, is $42.50 a day. Community corrections is the way forward. Using that program has shown to reduce recidivism greatly. Finally, while no one likes to talk about prison education, it's a must. We must have more prison education programs. While this is not politically popular due to the cost, it is shown to reduce recidivism rates by 43% in Alabama. We must invest more in these programs. Finally, drug courts and mental health courts are the key to success. Over 56% of all inmates have some sort of mental health disorder. And of those, 75% have some sort of substance abuse addiction. We have to fix those problems. This is not a politically popular issue, but it's one that Republicans and Democrats should stand together alike and try our best to fix. I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Secretary Wetzel.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite. It's always... Thank you. Thank you for the invite, Mr. Chairman and members, and thank you for allowing me to come and talk a little bit about what Pennsylvania's done over the past 3.5 years to really improve our correction system and criminal justice system as a whole. And the first thing I would absolutely encourage, and I believe is an imperative as we talk about this issue, to really start at what we have common ground on. And I think what we can all agree on, it doesn't matter what room I'm in, and you know, in this business of politics, there's rarely anything that we can all agree on. But the one thing that we can all agree on is what we want out of our correction system. And what we want is that when someone comes in the front end of the system, when they get out of the back end of the system, they're at least not worse. I mean, it's just that simple. So if you start with that, and you start with what I would call the prime directive, and the prime directive is every decision we make will be a decision that research indicates is likely to have the best outcome. And if you sprinkle that throughout the whole system, starting at the front end, then you can't go wrong. And in this environment where, you know, in Pennsylvania, our budget is $2 billion. We're the third line item in the state general fund spending. And I know that because I hear it every place I go, right? So if we're going to spend that much money, let's make sure we spend it well. And so when you start at the front end of the system, and I know the focus of this discussion is what we can do in the back end, but you can't talk about the back end without talking about the front end. And if you're not assessing risk when an individual first comes in the system, I don't know how you make a decision. I don't know how you reach that goal having better outcomes. So when we talk a lot about risk assessment, think of it in context of diagnoses, right? So if I went to a doctor and said, you know, I'm not sure what's going on, and told him my symptoms, and he said, oh, you have cancer, I'd say, well, hold on, you're gonna do some tests, right? That's what you should be saying to me. Hold on, what do you mean this person has to get sent to a state prison or federal prison? You're gonna do some tests, right? You're gonna see if that decision is the decision most likely to get the best outcome, which is someone be less likely to commit crime. And so that risk assessment or diagnosis needs to also understand what the root cause of the crime is. And if it's addiction, provide programming for addiction, because you can put an addict in prison for 10 years, they're going to come out the back end addict if you don't address that. So that's not a good return on investment from that approach. Or if they're mentally ill and we don't address the mental illness, that's not a good return on investment because they're going to commit another crime. And again, keep in mind outcomes. So what can we do on the back end? And really when you focus on the back end, think of it in context of what barriers remains for the individual to be successful when they get out. And so what we did is we looked at, first of all, really simple things. Like in 2008, we released 20,000 offenders, and we released 300 offenders with an ID. Now, what can you do without an ID in this country today? Not much, right? And when you talk about does it make sense to buy an offender an ID, they were spending an extra 2 weeks in a halfway house because they didn't have an ID at $70 a day. So we put an initiative forward. Last year we released 9,000 inmates, up from 300 with IDs, but it's 9,000 out of 20, so we're not bragging too much because we should be closer to 20,000 out of 20. But it's just those simple things. So what are the other barriers? The other big thing we did, and probably the most impactful thing we did, is we performance contract our halfway house. So we had a study done in 2009 by University of Cincinnati, and they found that 95% of our programs were failing. In other words, if I would release an offender directly on the street, they'd be likely to have a lower recidivism rate than if we put them through a halfway house. And for these great outcomes, we were spending $110 million. So we gutted the whole system, we rebid all the contracts, and we put performance measures in the contracts. So earlier on in our administration, we did a baseline recidivism study, and we used that baseline to say to the providers of halfway house services, listen, when we send offenders through your center, we want you to do A, B, C, and D, but that's all well and good. When they come out, they better have a lower recidivism rate, or at least not a higher one. If they have a lower recidivism rate, you get a 1% increase at the end of the year. If you keep it within one standard deviation above or below the baseline recidivism rate, you continue in good standing. If it's increased, you get 1 6-month warning, then we fire you. And if it's a state-run center, we close you. So the theme here is it's okay to expect outcomes, and frankly, for the investment we're doing, we should expect outcomes from our system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. Representative Madden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. My name's Jerry Madden. I served 20 years in the Texas legislature. I'm not a lawyer, never was on a corrections or criminal justice committee, and never had a bill in correction matters until early in my 13th year when our conservative speaker, Tom Craddock, called me into his office in January 2005 and told me, you're going to be chairman of corrections. Of course, I thanked him, as in my mind I'm thinking, oh God, why me? What did I do to deserve this? And then I asked him the second most important question in my life. I asked him, Mr. Speaker, what do you want me to do? And he gave me the 8 words that changed my life. He said, don't build new prisons. They cost too much. Mission, guys, mission. These are the words that led to Texas's reform. I'm an engineer and West Point grad, and I worked through the problem like a military engineer would work through it. First started by trying to find out who in the Texas legislature knew anything about corrections. There were not very many. I know that would surprise all of you here. You wouldn't have them either. But my friends directed me to the dean of the Texas Senate and the criminal justice chairman, a Democrat named John Whitmire. I went to him with my charge, and in about a 2-hour meeting, we meshed perfectly. Now, I knew John, but I never worked on legislation with him. But it was a bipartisan beginning of our team. We looked at the projections of expanded prison population and determined first we did not want to violate prior court directives on overcrowding. So we had two choices, either to let people out early or to slow the rate of people coming in. Guess which would not fly in Tough on Crime, Texas. So we went after and looked at how do you break the cycle of people coming into prison. We always put public safety first, but we had people telling us that with added resources, there were many convicted individuals we could safely keep in our community. We tried a bill in 2005 to work on probation and passed it through the legislature, but it was vetoed by the governor. Best thing that ever happened to us. Forced us to go back and rework our efforts, to bring in a lot more people to look at probation and the reasons for the veto. We looked at programs that were available in Texas prison, on parole, on probation, in the courts, and in our juvenile system. We brought in statistical help to tell us if we changed our supplemental programs, what would happen to our recidivism rate. In late 2006, our Legislative Budget Board came out with a prediction that we would have 17,700 more prisoners in Texas by the year 2012. And we would need to build 3 prisons in the 2007-2008 biennium, costing over $530 million. Our plan was ready at that time and would keep our prison population stable, according to our data, and would cost less than half of the new prisons. We went to the governor and legislative leaders and with our plan and were given the go-ahead. This is what we did. We added substance abuse treatment beds in prison, on parole, and probation. We added intermediate sanction beds for parole and probation. We expanded specialty courts, put more funding for mental health treatment for the prisoners. We also brought back 1,800 prisoners that we had sent out to the county jails. All of these ideas and others were accepted. And what are our results? Crime rates have continued to drop to levels not seen since the 1960s. Arrest rates in Texas are down. 3 prisons and 6 juvenile facilities are permanently closed. Significantly fewer people are on felony probation. The parole rates in Texas rose from 24% the years we started to 36% last year, and the parole revocations dropped from almost 11,000 a year in 2005 to less than 5,900 last year. Our prison population is the same as it was in 2007, and LBB last week predicted we would not need to build new prisons until 2019. Our juvenile populations have fallen from over 4,500 to under 1,300. Our state savings are over $2.2 billion as of today and growing. An equally important offspring of our efforts is the national level, where the Texas Public Policy Foundation in 2010 created Right on Crime, the national conservative voice for criminal justice reform. These and steps by organizations like CSG, Pew, NCSL, and ALEC have taken our work as an example for reforms throughout the state. I've been asked to give some guidance from Texas on what would help the federal prisons and correction reform. Our system is the state system that's closest in size to your federal system. We did our work in a bipartisan manner in an area where even at the federal level today there's hope reform ideas can be bipartisan. We have the examples of the states that have now done reforms in this manner. Pennsylvania, Georgia, Kentucky, Alaska, South Dakota, Idaho, and Texas legislators passed their major reform packets with overwhelming support from both parties. In each of the states, there are think tanks, organizations, and individuals with a great deal of knowledge and numerous ideas about what can be done. In Washington, there are even more people who would be willing to work together for positive reform. You already have legislators from both parties and both chambers presenting legislation that can be used for improvements, and most of them are based off the ideas we started in Texas. Also, there are now evidence-based practices to give direction to policymakers about programs and work and those that do not. Evidence-based practices should be required for all of those. We had several recommendations Right on Crime made. I leave them there in the documentations that we have.
Thank you very much, Representative. Doctor?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today and to testify alongside these gentlemen who have really demonstrated what engaging in responsible prison reform on the ground means, and also engaging in evidence-based practice. You're kind of living what the Urban Institute promotes through its own research on what works. So I thank you for that. Since you've heard about the successes in the states already, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I would like to refer you to this publication that the chairman referenced in his opening remarks, and that is a report the Urban Institute did assessing the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, looking at 17 states. It documents the sweeping reforms that those states have engaged in and the projected impact of those reforms. That report was released earlier this year, but a few months prior to that, the Urban Institute released a report called Stemming the Tide. In this report, we looked at the growth in the federal system, the drivers of the growth in that system, and a variety of policy changes and the impact that those changes would have both on population and cost. So what I'd like to do today is to describe that a bit and then talk about lessons learned from the states and how it can be applied to the federal system. As we know, the federal system mirrors the experiences of the states in terms of growth in many ways, although arguably more so compared to many states experiencing a nearly 8-fold increase since 1980. That growth has caused severe overcrowding, between 30 to 50%, depending on the facility, much higher for the high security facilities across the BOP. The BOP's budget has been increasing alongside that population growth. It's crowding out other important public safety priorities. The BOP budget has grown at twice the rate of the DOJ budget over time, and yet those budget increases aren't sufficient to maintain staffing. Inmate to staff ratios have increased 20% since 2000. All of this creates a scenario where you have serious overcrowding that poses a threat to public safety. It poses a threat to safety on the inside, the safety and security of the staff and inmates who reside there. But it's also a threat to public safety on the outside, because when the facilities are crowded, you can't offer the programming and treatment necessary to prevent recidivism. So if you can't prevent recidivism, you're causing more victimization in the community. In this report, we track we document the drivers of the growth in the federal system. It's basically simple math, more people going into prison, staying for longer periods of time. By far, drug offenders are the biggest feeder of the growth in the system. And this is the population that would yield the biggest impact on any efforts to reduce or slow that growth. Many solutions have been tested and proven by the states. They're documented here, and we've heard from the prior witnesses about them. States have slowed prison growth. They've reduced overcrowding. They've saved taxpayers' money in the process. And according to a recent Pew Charitable Trust report, these states have experienced declines in the crime rate alongside the states that have not engaged in reform. So what lessons are transferable to the federal system? I think it's first important to note that there are differences in the system. The federal system has a different population, much less violent on average than most state prison populations. It's also the case that the federal prison isn't driven by supervision violators, as we see a lot in the states. And yet there are reforms that are transferable, and these are both front-end reforms, as we call them, and back-end reforms. By front-end reforms, I'm referring to changes in sentencing policies, who goes to prison, how long is their sentence length. And by back-end, I'm talking about earned credit mechanisms that encourage program participation and good behavior. And I don't have to tell this committee much about those reforms, because many of you have signed on to legislation that promotes those reforms on the federal level. The Smarter Sentencing Act, the Justice Safety Valve Act, the Public Safety Enhancement Act. These acts are looking at both front-end and back-end changes, including reducing mandatory minimums, expanding the safety valve, expanding judicial discretion in a number of ways, and incentivizing inmates to participate in programs and treatment that they can benefit from. It's also important to acknowledge that there's another kind of front end, and that's embodied in evidence-based practice that looks at the importance of prevention, education, and employment even prior to someone entering the system, to encourage them to avoid that altogether. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Doctor. The chair will withhold his questions till the end. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to have you all with us today. Senator Ward, Alabama has just passed a statute authorizing the Alabama Prison Reform Task Force is at an earlier stage in the Justice Reinvestment Initiative process with other states. Are there certain states that you are looking for to serve as leaders in this model? and what reforms do you think have been most effective in those states?
Congressman, I would say first and foremost, I look to my friend Representative Madden down here from Texas. I think they're the model probably for reforms across the country. As I've said before, there's really no silver bullet answer to the question of what's going to solve the prison problem. I think that the answer comes about in many facets. Most importantly, as I said before, 1, your community corrections program, 2, drug courts, and 3, mental health courts. All those provide tools not only for the front end before incarceration has to occur, but also on the back end, and reduces recidivism rate and is also cheaper on the taxpayers. I think the more that we utilize those programs, the less you're going to have a turnaround of someone coming back into the system. And that's the key for everyone. If you can reduce recidivism, in the long run, you'll reduce your prison population. I think Texas has been a model reform for that. Most recently, other states have also adopted it. Prison ministry work in Georgia. We've seen also a new pardon and parole data sharing process in Mississippi, which has been very successful. Also, community correction incentives, where incentives are given to community correction programs that show a higher reduction in recidivism rates, then the financial reward for those programs are rewarded through the budget process, as they're doing in Arkansas. So there are a large number of options out there. However, I'd have to point to Texas being the model for the rest of the country, and it's due to the Justice Reinvestment Initiative.
Thank you, Senator. Each of you, I think, mentioned the enormous cost involved. If these reform programs result as hoped would be the case, it seems to me that savings could be realized. Am I missing the mark when I say that?
Not at all.
I mean, recidivism and overcrowding are two issues that continue to plague us, and they are obviously related. Doctor, does the DOP currently perform risk assessment of its inmates for purposes of administering recidivism-reducing programs or determining likelihood to reoffend?
My understanding is that the BOP does use risk and needs assessments for some purposes. I don't know the details of how they're used to guide who gets what types of programs or treatment.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? With that,
I was just going to weigh in on your previous question about states that are examples, though.
fire away.
Because I'll follow on that, because North Carolina did some wonderful work also in their things, and they're an example that I use nationally when talking to states about what they did in their technology aspects for their probation and parole divisions. They really have done some creative work there that has caused a reduction in their prison populations also.
On that, your favorable note to my home state is appreciated, and I yield back.
I was honored, as a matter of fact, to be there when the governor and the speaker and your Senate Pro Tem leader decided to go ahead and start that. I was actually in the room with them at that time with about 5 of them.
And I'll convey that when I go back home. Thank you, sir. Thank you all for being here.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, one of the themes we've heard from all of the witnesses is a reliance on research and data rather than slogans and sound bites. Senator Ward, can you say a word about the Applied Research Service and what they do for you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the problem with corrections traditionally has been the policymakers, you and I. We take it upon ourselves to what sounds good, as you said, the policy sound bites. Can I lock them up and throw away the key because it fits on a bumper sticker? And guess what? It wins elections. And that's unfortunate, and that's how we got in the circumstances we're in today. Applied research, in short, takes a data-driven approach to corrections. It determines this particular offender, what classification should they be classified in with regard to their sentencing guidelines? Are they perhaps eligible for, due to their background, due to their education level, due to the circumstances of their act, are they eligible perhaps for community corrections instead of incarceration? The data sharing actually goes on throughout all the correctional facilities in Alabama. Therefore, it's a broad-based view of each individual inmate is determined what level of incarceration is maybe more appropriate, and is an alternative sentencing program possibly better for this inmate. That's how it works in Alabama, and I think that's a big part of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative as well, and that's what they try to promote is instead of policy or a debate by your heart, it's more about data-driven through your head as to what's more logical.
Now, you and Mr. Wetzel talked about the triage going in, assessing people. How does that work if you're saddled with mandatory minimums and no parole?
And I have to tell you, I think the notion of, that's one of the problems how we got where we are, of the no parole, particularly for the nonviolent offenders. You have to look at a change in your parole policies. In Alabama, for example, we have 53,000 offenders currently under the supervision of our boards of pardon and parole today. That is actually 200 offenders per individual caseworker. The national average is 75 offenders per caseworker. The no parole notion for nonviolent offenders particularly, it just doesn't work. In my opinion, that's one part of the broken system we're in today.
Now, what effect does overcrowding have on the effectiveness of job training and education programs in the prison?
It has a huge impact, because what has happened is, as society's looked around, and states are having shortfalls in all their budgets. What's happened is we've had to cut back on K through 12. It's very hard to go back home and sell politically. Well, but we've got to invest more in prison education. The overcrowding problem, what it's created is you have so many inmates that you actually don't have, one, the physical plant facilities to provide the education, skill opportunities they need, but two, it's created a situation where you're spending so much money on the actual incarceration, the feeding, and the health care that the education component is being left aside. And that, in my opinion, is what leads to a higher recidivism rate as well.
Thank you. Ms. Levine, you had mentioned reinvesting the savings in some of these programs. One of the problems and challenges is the people saving the money aren't the people making the investment. And so you make the investment and then somebody else saves the money. How do you recapture the savings in that scenario?
That's a tremendous challenge, I think, that the states are experiencing. And many of them are handling that by actually engaging in what we call upfront reinvestment, so that they, at the point of passing legislation where they know that their projections show that the policy changes will yield meaningful reductions in populations and thus yield savings, at that very same time they'll say, let's right now use those anticipated savings and dedicate them to activities like treatment, diversion programs, more supervision, et cetera.
Now, you mentioned front end, kind of dual front end, one front end after conviction, but also the very early prevention, primary prevention and early intervention. How do you recapture those savings?
So capturing savings from very, very early prevention efforts is very difficult to do, and it's not usually something we discuss when we talk about justice reinvestment, because justice reinvestment is largely about averting growth or reducing the prison population, yielding savings that way. I'm not aware of people who have actually looked at early prevention programs and looked at how cost beneficial they are. But we at the Urban Institute have looked at various recidivism reduction programs and had found that several of them are indeed cost beneficial.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
I thank the chairman, and thank you all for being here. It's a very important topic. It's something that literally affects millions of people, and yet doesn't always rise to the tier 1 level that it should. I believe it's one of the core things that government should and has to be involved with. So your expertise and your participation here today, we certainly do appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 2 articles. One is by Mr. Newt Gingrich and Pat Nolan, an opening for bipartisanship on prison reform, as well as a Salt Lake Tribune op-ed, A Better Way Than Filling Jails with Nonviolent Offenders by Kirk Jowers, was published on July 13th.
Without objection.
Mr. Madden, I'd like you to talk a little bit about, and then Mr. Wetzel, if we could, about risk assessments. Do they really work? I mean, you have somebody who's come into prison. Can you very quickly go through this assessment process? How does it work? What's your experience with it? And how do we make the most of it?
They actually work. They can work very well if you use the right ones. There are a lot of risk assessment tools that are out there. I always say to everybody, I'm not sponsoring any one risk assessment tool because there's a whole lot of different ones, but to come down at least on one that you are consistent with in your state and use that, and it's a great tool. Now, that's the one thing. There were 2 things that now happen in justice reinvestment actions throughout the states that we really didn't put in Texas to start with, because we were 2 legislators that were wandering, so to speak, in the dark. We didn't have the Pew people. We didn't have the Council of State Governments like all these guys had. We were just us doing what we thought was the best thing in the criminal justice system. We did not do the risk assessment thing, and it has been put in later legislative sessions than what we started in 2007. But it's one of the two things that I tell the states that they all need to have and they all need to do is have a risk assessment tool. They really do work, and you should use it as often in the cycle as is really fiscally responsible. You should do it when a person's first arrested, when they're first, go before the judge the first time, when they go probation, et cetera, and in the prison system too.
Thank you. I wanted to get to Mr. Wetzel, please.
I was going to say, in the prison system in particular, you could do it when they first come, and you should do it in subsequent periods of time while they're there. And there's two things on risk assessment.
Hold that thought for a second. I do want to follow up with you, but I'm going to run out of time if I don't allow Mr. Wetzel to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the notion of risk assessment, people act like it's a new thing, but I'm pretty sure an 18-year-old young man pays higher car insurance than my 82-year-old mom who drives a VW Bug, right? Why? Actuarial risk assessment.
You got an 82-year-old mother who drives a VW Bug, really?
I do. Slowly.
With you in it? I'd like to see that, yeah. All right, keep going.
But so risk assessment's been around forever. Applying it to this and having an understanding of who comes in your system, every system does that. Every system does something when someone comes in.
All right, but what works, what doesn't work?
What works is actuarial risk assessment, so it's research-based, and it identifies both the risks that the individual presents and also their needs. And then the rub, though, is that you have programming that addresses those needs, especially the criminogenic needs that are able to be impacted, like addiction, criminal thinking, those kinds of things.
Thank you. I've introduced, and many of the members here on this panel have helped co-sponsor a bill, H.R. 2656, the Public Safety Enhancement Act. I do think it is time for Congress to take a much more proactive role in pushing the Bureau of Prisons in this direction. I appreciate panel members on both sides of this aisle and helping that. Perhaps as a follow-up, if you all could look at these legislation and help us get your feedback, we'd certainly appreciate it.
Already have, obviously, with Senator Cornyn as the sponsors. Also talked a little bit about what we did in Texas. Let me analyze one thing on the risk assessment since you got 30 seconds left.
Sure.
The risk assessment, there's two different types of risk you have. The risk of the people doing the same crime that they did, and the risk of violent offenses. And you need to make sure your risk analysis truly analyze the differences between the two, because a lot of your prisoners are low risk of violent crimes, but high risk of doing the dumb thing that got them to prison the first time.
Thank you. Yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman Sensenbrenner. I just want the record to show that this is the most informative and thoughtful panel on this subject that I've heard in a long, long time. And I think you and Ranking Member Bobby Scott should be congratulated on putting this together. And, you know, I'm beginning to feel like there are more Republicans like yourself, Senator Ward, that are thinking about this. It's a wonderful thing. And what I wanted to start off by asking Dr. Lavigne is how would we prioritize these legislative recommendations? I'm going to get copies of this discussion here today because I think it needs to be shown around the country, not just to the people that are looking at it now or reading about it later. Where do we start? How do we get this thing on the road?
Right. I wouldn't recommend any one piece of legislation over another, but I will emphasize our conclusion in our report, and that is that you really need more than one. You cannot achieve meaningful reductions in the federal prison population looking only at for example, earned release or other back-end measures. The reason is because, as we've mentioned already, the degree of overcrowding is so great. It's so great that you really need to do a lot of different things to achieve reductions. So what we conclude is that it really needs to be a combination of both back-end and front-end reforms.
Mm-hmm. Would you, Senator, like to add anything on to this discussion?
You know, real briefly, Congressman, what I would say is this. You know, it's going to take some political courage more than anything else. I mean, the tools and the data that you've heard here today from my esteemed colleagues on this panel, I mean, we have experts from all over the country that can tell you some of the roadmaps. The problem we have, and let's face it, I'm from the reddest of red states. I'm almost as red as Utah. But, I mean, we're a very Republican conservative state. But at the end of the day, what we have to realize is the level of incarceration spending that we're doing now, the conditions of the facilities that we're doing, and what we're expecting as far as what comes out on the back end is not sustainable. It can't be sustained by our current fiscal policies in state government. It can't be sustained by what we would consider adequate conditions under the 8th Amendment. The data's there. The tools have been, we don't have to reinvent the wheel with the states. They've already been done. But we have to have the political courage to say, this is broken. We have to fix it. Whether you're from a red state, blue state, purple state, we all agree there is a broken system, and this is one area that I think we can all agree on how to fix it because the tools are out there.
Well, are there more conservatives coming around to this point of view being expressed here in the Judiciary Committee?
Absolutely. I think there are people here on Capitol Hill that have expressed on several occasions, both in the Republican Party and Democrat Party, that it's one issue we can work together on. And I think in state government we realize too, as a conservative, I want to see a much more efficient way of government being operated. But you can't run an efficient government the way we're doing it right now with corrections. So, yeah, I think there are.
May I take a shot at that, too?
Please do.
Since I'm with the Right on Crime people at Texas Public Policy, and that's the national conservative voice that's speaking out on this, I will say that when we first did all these things and we had Pew conferences, the things that we basically got out of that from the states that did the reforms, and that's people like Georgia and Kentucky and North Carolina, those states basically said, go as much as you can, get all the areas that we're talking about. So the legislation that's out there now, whether that be, I've noticed the sponsors on both Senate and House legislation have been both conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, and they're mixed on the bills. That's a great sign, and I would highly encourage continuing, because that's the opportunities there that we found in the states. And that the great thing was that most of those pieces of legislation were passed almost unanimously and almost with total bipartisan support.
We have a Congressional Black Caucus conference coming up in September, and I think 3 or more of our colleagues who are on Judiciary Committee would welcome a panel with any of you that can be there with us to help get this word out.
Yeah, if the gentleman will yield, I would just urge you not to be afraid of the Congressional Black Caucus, because I've been and talked to them, and I'm still here.
Well, yeah, but you're one of those exceptional conservatives that I was bragging about along with Senator Ward. We're looking for more Sensenbrenners, more Wards. And we want to come together and make this real and not just a sensational hearing on August 15th.
I will say the gentleman's time has expired before people on the other side start criticizing me. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Madden, who in the federal system do you think is incarcerated because we're mad at them as opposed to being afraid of them?
Sure. When we discuss that on mad versus afraid, the ones that we're afraid of are clearly the people who would do a great deal of harm, and that's murderers and rapists and, yes, major drug dealers. I think we have some in the federal system.
Well, you know there are going to be very few people in federal prison because of rape or murder, because most of them are in state prison. So who in federal prison is there because we're just mad at them?
I would say that those people who are actually drug users are probably those who are mad at.
Well, now,
And
Chairman,
I don't know how many you have, but you have some.
There's nobody in federal prison for using drugs.
That-
They may be there for possession with intent to distribute. They may be there for conspiracy, but they're not there for using drugs. I ask you again, who is in federal prison because we're mad at them, not because we're afraid of them?
The nice thing is my studies that I had, Representative, was that I don't portray myself as a expert on other systems that they have. What I do have is I do have the knowledge of what other states have looked at in the data that they've looked into. I agree with you, though, that,
Mr.
that
Chairman,
they have to look at your own.
I'm not the one that said it.
I understand.
I didn't write that people are in federal prison because we're mad at them and not afraid of them. That was you that said it.
I think I wrote that we have people in the prisons that we're mad at and afraid of, and that was the distance that we used, particularly in the states in our discussions there.
Well, that necessarily assumes that the only reason to send someone to prison is because we're afraid of them, and I would argue that there are lots of other reasons to send people to prison other than the fact that we're afraid of them, like maybe the fact they didn't learn when we gave them probation, maybe they didn't learn when we put them through a diversion program.
One of the things that we look at the Texas Public Policy Foundation on a right on crime is overcriminalization and things that are made criminal law that basically we look at the things like the mens rea provisions. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm speaking in terms as the gentleman who says there are things that we make as overcriminalization. And we've specifically talked about that. I know there have been hearings up here about overcriminalization.
There have been.
And
Dr. Levine, let me ask you to help me understand a phrase that sometimes I struggle to understand, which is nonviolent offender.
Right. This was a challenge in our report because we lacked the data that we really needed to see what the criminal histories were of the people in the federal
system. Give me a for instance of a nonviolent offender.
What we did instead was to use security level. So those housed in low security federal facilities we assumed were nonviolent.
Did you look at the incident report?
I'm sorry, the what
Did
report?
Did you talk to the victim? I'm trying to get an idea because I've heard
No,
multiple witnesses use the phrase nonviolent offender and
this is a really good question and one that we would very much like to answer if we can get the right data from the Bureau of Prisons.
Well, here's the challenge, I readily agree. At least 80% of the crime I saw was drug and alcohol fueled. The difficulty we ran into when we tried to put a defendant in a nonviolent fact pattern into drug court, his or her defense attorney objected because it was much easier to just go straight probation than go to drug court. So how do you make someone post-adjudication go to drug court?
I don't have that answer.
Well, look, I'm with you. Drugs and alcohol drive 80% of the crime. And I'm not suggesting other people don't have the victim's perspective, but I am much more interested in the victim's perspective than I am the inmate's perspective. But when you have a defense attorney advising people to go straight probation, even though they're an addict, because that is easier than going through drug court, I don't know what you expect the state to do about that.
Congressman, I would say you incentivize it. I would say you make it more attractive. And I think everybody up here agrees the victim's rights should always come in front of the inmates.
Well, how do you incentivize it other than shortening the term of incarceration?
Well, what you do is, for example, if you have a choice of post-incarceration of probation or drug court, make it more attractive to go there. And I don't know the answer how you make it more attractive. Make it more attractive. Maybe shorten the term of the probation. Maybe lighten the terms of the probation
but that's
to incentivize them.
That's post-adjudication. That's not a diversion program. If you have a diversion program,
well, then do it ahead of time. Do it on the front end as well. You could do it on the front end as well. I mean, there's ways to incentivize it to make it more attractive as opposed to what the alternative is. And that's how you get around the defense attorney's argument.
Well, regrettably, I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing, and also to the ranking member. You know, like my colleague, I also have the victim's perspective in mind, and one of the things that has happened over the years as the incarceration rates have been so high is that we've not really thought about when we release people. In a lot of instances around our country, you have a tremendous number of people who are released to certain communities. and then they have no options because they're essentially have been, because of collateral consequences, they don't have an opportunity to work in the legal economy, and they go right back and commit crime. So having an over-concentration of people coming out of prison to particular communities then re-victimizes those communities. And so what I wanted to ask you about, because you talked about evidence-based programs, and I come from California, by the way, so you know we're really struggling with this, and the courts have required us to release people. So one of the issues that we're dealing with is that when people get out, how do you then reintegrate them into a community so that they have other options? So I wanted to ask you if there has been research about reentry programs that, you know, help people navigate their way so that they don't wind up incarcerated again. And then which collateral consequences do you feel we should eliminate at the federal level?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, there's ample research on ways that people can be prepared for successful reintegration. A lot of that research is actually embodied in the What Works in Reentry Clearinghouse. It's something that the Urban Institute developed in partnership with the Council of State Governments, funded by the Second Chance Act. And what we strove to do was to identify only the most rigorous studies out there, because a lot of people point to studies that are effective or not, but then when you look at them, you realize they're not really well conducted to begin with. So after screening out only the most rigorous studies, we then identified by different types of reentry mechanisms, say enhanced education, employment, housing, treatment, what programs worked and for whom. And all of that is housed on a website that's searchable, and you'll see that there's an ample body of research that suggests that several things. One, reentry should really start at the point of incarceration.
Right.
So you use the risk and needs assessments. You identify what kind of programs and services and treatment that they need. You make sure that they get them. And then also that you really need a very good transition from prison to the community. So you don't just release them and say, good luck. You release them and you have that handoff to community services and support.
Right, that's one of the things that we're doing in California, unfortunately, is releasing people, and some people who have been in, you know, solitary confinement forever, getting released and going straight on the street with not a lot happening. Mm-hmm. So one of the phenomena is kind of happening in the Los Angeles area, and in LA, since we have 30% of the prison population who come out, one of the things that's happening is a number of formerly incarcerated individuals are starting their own little mom and pop nonprofits to essentially handhold people. Right. Some people who've been locked up too long don't even know how to use public transportation or you know, do the basics. And so I'm wondering, in your evidence-based research, do you have very small nonprofits that have been studied like this? And that's for anybody.
I haven't found those in any of the very rigorous studies that we've looked at, but it stands to reason, and actually there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that the best kind of support for returning citizens is that comes from folks who have already experienced incarceration and can really relate and speak to them and help them and understand what their challenges are.
And for the other panelists in my remaining time, do you see a difference with private prisons, people coming out of private prisons versus government-run prisons?
Pennsylvania doesn't do private prisons.
In Alabama, we spend so little on our incarceration rate that actually it cost us more to use private prisons. And from the data that we looked at in around 2006, when we actually did experiment with private prisons, there was absolutely no difference between the two facilities as far as the outcome-based results of the offenders released.
Texas?
Texas has some private prisons. The recidivism rate that you get from the private prisons, since they are generally there for our lower-level offenders, match pretty closely the state facilities that we have for low-level offenders. They're about the same.
Good. Thank you. Yield back my time.
The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ward, and this applies to everybody on the panel as well, but the theme that runs throughout most of your testimony is the need of flexibility in our criminal justice system, alternatives to detention, individualized approaches to parole, treatment, and much else. I have a bill with Congressman Scott that it's called the Smarter Sentencing Act, which would give judges more flexibility to make individualized sentencing determinations. Can you address the issue of flexibility in sentencing in your state and the importance of an individualized approach in criminal justice more generally?
Yeah, unfortunately in Alabama, we had a situation where we had, and use the phrase, too much flexibility up until about 2006. Basically, I could go to one county and be sentenced to community corrections or probation. I could go to the next county over for the exact same crime, the exact same instance, and be sentenced to 10 years in prison. So what we did was we came up with a uniform voluntary set of guidelines. Those guidelines, again, were still ignored by some of the judges, taken on by other judges. These guidelines were created through a data-driven empirical analysis to look at the system. We now have presumptive guidelines in Alabama. The presumptive guidelines do give the judges flexibility because there are certain circumstances when a judge says this person really belongs in community corrections. And they can show an exception to the presumptive guidelines in writing and say, this is why I believe this inmate should go to, or this offender should go to community corrections. The flexibility is necessary because the moment you start putting everyone in a small box, you're hamstringing yourself and you're restricting the judicial right to determine individual case-by-case basis. And that's how alternative sentencing has really been successful, because drug courts are handled by judges who say, you know, we need an exception to this set of circumstances. So in my state, I think that's a very good thing, and it's been very successful as well.
Excellent. And that's what we're trying to do here in the House of Representatives as well, is to give a little bit more flexibility within the guidelines, to give the judges a little bit more flexibility. You also discuss the benefit of certain sentencing reduction programs, and I think these are all good ideas, but I'm wondering why we don't get the sentences right in the first place, which sounds like that's what you were doing in Alabama.
You're exactly right.
So according to a review of the Justice Department, records of prisoners released since 1994, prisoners are more likely to recidivate the longer they stay in prison. And the reason why America has such a larger population of prisoners than Europe is that we imprison them so much longer. Given these facts, is it Levine, shouldn't we have the goal at the outset of making sentences fit the crime and give judges the ability to avoid unnecessarily long sentences?
Well, this is my own personal opinion, but I think that you know, judicial discretion is kind of an interesting thing. When I was working many years ago in Texas for the Sentencing Commission, at the time judges had between 5 and 99 years for first-degree felonies. That it was too much discretion. Everybody agreed with that. But in the federal system, you see restricted discretion because of mandatory minimums. And your bill, sir, to have mandatory minimums for certain types of drug offenders, I think makes sense, because it's not mandating that sentences be lower. It's just giving the judges a little bit more discretion.
Okay. Now I just have a general question. I was a criminal defense attorney, so I don't dislike him as much as my good friend here to my left. But I always wonder why we don't have shorter sentences and harsher punishment. So have any of you considered what could we do at the state level and at the federal level to make sure that the sentences, when you go to prison, you actually have harsh punishment? I'll just give you one example. I went to talk to a junior high school class of Hispanic students, and one of the students kept looking at me. I was trying to explain to them why it was important to go to college and do all those things. And one of the kids just looked at me and says, hey, I have an uncle in prison, and he gets 3 meals a day, and he has 4 walls, and he gets fed, and he's actually enjoying being in prison. That broke my heart to hear something like that. What could we do at the state level or at the federal level to actually make prison a little bit more difficult so they're not thinking that they're actually on a vacation while they're there?
Congressman, I was just going to say, first of all, you know, these rehabilitation programs, forcing them to learn a skill, forcing them to work while they're in there, not only does it make the sentence harsher, but also makes them more productive when eventually they do get released, and 95% do get released. And as your colleague to your right said, or to your left said, the crimes that occur in state prisons, or what got you to a state prison, are very different from what got you into a federal prison. We have a lot more violent offenders, so you have to give them those skills, make them work harder, and while they're working, they're learning a skill while they're incarcerated.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling the hearing. Senator Ward, and you mentioned the political will and the political courage to get it done, and my colleague, Mr. Schaefer's, entered into the record the Newt Gingrich article. The disappointing part about it is that the article was written in 2011, calling for all of us to come together, and I think that you see mutual ideas here, and in fact that many of us are on the same page, but it's 2014 and we're still on step one. So part of the question is how we move it forward without people who are afraid of it being branded, I guess, soft on crime, and I just think it's something we have to do. Let me ask you all, I'm going to give you a figure, and then I want you all to give me your estimate, and I'm not going to hold you to it, but right feel for you. With the federal prisons, what a good time credit would be, we give about 54 days a year. For every 7 additional days that we would give, we would save about $200 million over 5 years, about $30 million a year. In my state of Louisiana, we went in and doubled good time under Republican governor, Republican legislature, because we saw it made sense. And all of our southern states are kind of moving in that trend. If you just had to throw out a number of how many days of earned good time you think you can absorb without making the public less safe, if you had to throw out a number, what would you throw out? Or a range?
I would say in Alabama you could probably add 10 additional days. That would be the general consensus. Again, I'm off the cuff, 10 additional days to what we do now, but we would still be below what Louisiana's average is.
10 days per what?
I'm sorry? 10 additional days to what we do now, which I believe is 54.
We're 54 in the feds, and while Mr. Wetzel answers, I'll look and quickly glance and see what Alabama's at.
Yeah, well, we're not a good time state, and so that's not really how we relate to the world. We really try to introduce risk assessment at sentencing, so make a good decision. So everybody knows at the sentencing time how much time, at minimum, the individual is going to serve. And then to the extent you can individualize decisions and make good decisions at who can get out earlier, I think that's what makes sense in our context. So I don't really have
well, I think it's still incentivized behavior that will.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
Right, that will
I don't
reduce
have a point of reference
your
to
sentence.
throw a number out to you.
Okay.
It was interesting. I was over in your state of Louisiana before their legislature this last session on several bills that they were doing that they have done, and a couple that they didn't do, dealing with the powers of individuals in your state. But a couple of recommendations that are there. We have a parole board that looks. We're probably more of a good time state than John's is, but we're not the good time state either when it comes to incarceration. But what you can look at is what are you doing with your parole and your parole actions that you have, and putting people or releasing them, what amounts to a release time. We had one of the things we actually did in our looks was we had the parole board that was saying this person's eligible for parole. All they have to do is have this drug treatment program. It's an 18-month drug treatment program. Problem we had in Texas when we did this is there was a waiting period for that drug program of over a year. People were just sitting there before they started an 18-month program. They were sitting there waiting for over a year. Now, this is the great thing as an engineer who could sit there and think about studies of queuing theory and how much did we spend on just keeping those people to wait for a program that they needed and then were eligible for release. We saved a lot of money by putting in additional drug treatment facilities in the prison, so we shortened that waiting time substantially. And those are the kinds of things you can look at doing.
Have any of you all enacted reentry courts? I passed a reentry court bill a couple years ago. Now it's coming full circle, and we've just won some awards in Louisiana, which would allow the judge to sentence a person to, and actually they send them to Angola, which is our state penitentiary. But after they can, with a range of between 0 and 10 years. But after completing programs and going through training, at some point the warden will declare that they're not a risk to society, and the warden then has the ability to petition for their release. And that has been a very effective model in getting people actually treatment, skills, workforce development, and all of those other things to put them back on the streets in an area where our recidivism rate with those offenders are very, very low, even though they're going to our state penitentiary.
That's been a political debate with our state prosecutors, although I think it's an idea a lot of them are warming up to now. But yes, we've looked at that legislation 3 years ago to do that, failed in Alabama. However, I think there's a lot more support now for that than there used to be due to the crisis we're in.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Mr. Chairman, I first of all want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. It's a very important topic, and thank all of you for being here. I apologize, I've been in an armed service hearing that was in conflict, and I hope I'm not asking you a question that you've already addressed, but I was wondering if you could give me your thoughts on the mental health aspects and how we are assessing individuals when they come into the system, what you view in terms of our treatment capabilities, and any recommendations you might have along those lines to any of you that would feel that you could offer us some suggestions on that.
Let me, in Pennsylvania, 21% of our population is on the mental health roster, which equates to about 10,000 people, which means that I'm responsible for the delivery of mental health services for more individuals than any other one entity in the state. And I think that's pretty consistent around the country. And when you talk about a challenging group, a group that requires, first of all, good assessment to include a full psych workup, which means resources and time.
Do you feel you're getting that now?
Excuse me?
Do you feel you're getting that kind of assessment?
Yeah, we do. We certainly, and we've bolstered that. I mean, we've come up short on some of the back end stuff. In other words, providing, keeping folks healthy in general population. And what we've seen around the country, in Pennsylvania in particular, was people not getting sick from a mental health standpoint and then ending up in segregation. And so sometimes when you put mentally ill offenders in an intensive environment that prisons are, it's not the most therapeutic environment in all cases. So it's certainly a challenging thing. So I think assessment at the front end, individualizing a treatment plan for each individual, splitting out the seriously mentally ill, which is anywhere between 7 and 10% of our population, and putting them on a completely separate track. So creating safe environments in general population, and then for reentry for that group in particular, there has to be a lot of coordination between the prison system and the community infrastructure to include case management and the treatment providers, because we have places in rural Pennsylvania where you're waiting 2 or 3 months to get an appointment with a psychiatrist. We're releasing a mentally ill offender with 30 days of medication. Oops, you know, what happens in that 30 or 45 days that individual doesn't have medication, and it's not good. So I think it's a very challenging group. I think that there needs to be as much attention on creating a community safety net so mentally ill folks are more likely or less likely to come to prison in the first place. People get concerned that corrections isn't going to adjust and be able to deal with mentally ill offenders. I'm concerned that we are going to be able to adjust. And I'm not sure that's the right thing from a public policy standpoint.
Congressman, I would say on too, yes. One big issue, and this is a distinction between the federal and the state level, is how do you define mental health problems? The Bureau of Justice Statistics says that 56% of all state inmates have a mental health problem. However, if you look at the definition of mental health problem on the federal level, it's actually that number shrinks dramatically. I have a child, for example, on the autism spectrum. They would not be considered mental health. Mm-hmm. There are those out there who are coming back from war with post-traumatic stress syndrome. They would not be considered for these purposes mental health. So I think how we define mental health is going to go a long way to how do we prevent or give the proper treatment for those who have already been incarcerated or to prevent them from becoming incarcerated in the first place.
Good. Anybody else?
What I would add to this conversation is the intersection between people with substance addiction and mental health problems, and those are often co-occurring disorders. And looking at the federal system and the large volume of drug offenders who are in the system, that could be an issue that you'll want to explore.
Good. Well, thank you all so much for doing that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, Councilman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself to wrap up. I think the best thing that we can do in the remaining days of this Congress is to reauthorize the Second Chance Act. That has been very useful. The gentleman from Virginia and I have been pushing this. It took a couple of years to get it passed the first time, and I think that we ought to get it reauthorized and at minimum tweaked so that it is more effective. What I'm looking at in the whole continuum of somebody who gets involved in the criminal justice system is we start out with the arrest. Then we have decisions that have to be made by the prosecutor and defense counsel. There's a trial, there's a conviction, then there is an investigation by a probation or parole department pre-sentencing to advise the court on what the proper sentence would be. Then there is incarceration and what goes on during incarceration, and then goes on what goes on after release. So there is a huge continuum of various groups of people, often with conflicting interests, to put their oar in the waters in dealing with the individual who has run afoul of the law. My concern in dealing with this is that there is an awful lot of bureaucratic inertia, or the bureaucracy trying to save their jobs by saying that they have a larger casework than is really necessary, and as a result of putting more notches on the report that goes up to the boss, we end up not treating those people as humans with special needs. Now, some of them might require incarceration, particularly if they're involved in a violent crime or drug trafficking. We've talked about mental health issues, and then we've talked about what goes on in prison and how they're supervised if they are released on probation. How do we manage to lick the bureaucratic inertia that keep things the way they are because people have jobs and they want to keep their jobs and are afraid of losing them if there's changes? And I'd like to ask you, Secretary Wetzel, to start out with this, because you are the chief of a bunch of public employees in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who work in the correction system there.
Yeah, I think it's really important to pay attention to the process. And I think oftentimes we set up processes that incentivize the wrong things. So you alluded to a situation where someone really could benefit, or an agency could really benefit by not necessarily making the best decision and control caseloads from that manner. So I think it's very important that we look what we incentivize, and we look at how the system works. And Pennsylvania is a place where we looked, and we had 2,400 inmates every month come up who were eligible for a parole hearing. The parole board had the capacity for 1,800 a month, right? So every month we're losing, we have 600 offenders. But here's the rub, and here's what we were doing poorly. We weren't being deliberate about who got skipped. So if I was an individual who was not following any rules, didn't do any programs, was in trouble constantly, and was in disciplinary, and you're an individual who's done everything we've asked you to do, we're equal likely to get skipped. If I get skipped, it costs me nothing, because I wasn't getting out anyhow. If you get skipped, it costs us from a standpoint that you were likely to get paroled, so it's going to cost us real money. But beyond that, what message are we sending? If we're saying we're a justice system, you've done everything we've asked you to do, and now because of our bureaucracy or incompetence, however you want to describe it, you're not getting a hearing. So I think it's those kinds of things, really looking at how this system is structured and making sure it's structured in a manner that we're delivering what we need to do and making just smart, common sense decisions. I think we can get where we need to get to.
Okay, I have 45 seconds left. So, Senator Ward, you're the incumbent policymaker. How can you answer my question?
One of the biggest areas I've noticed is a disparity in how court cases are actually counted. We had a situation in Alabama where one southern county counted each charge filed as a quote-unquote caseload. And in my particular county, Shelby County, those 5 same charges that were filed down there considered one caseload for purposes of statistics. We have to make sure we have accurate data with regard to caseload. Second, he's absolutely right. The Secretary's right. You've got to incentivize the idea of how can I get your caseload down? How do we incentivize you to have a lower caseload? If we can come up with that solution, I think it encourages your judges and your prosecutors to pursue the alternative sentencing programs.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I would like to thank all of the witnesses. This has been a very interesting and fascinating hearing, and it's something that is really necessary, in terms of not only trying to reduce our prison population, but also trying to reduce the recidivism rate. And I think there's a public interest in both, but the greater public interest is reducing the recidivism rate, because somebody who gets out and reoffends is going to cause a whole different group of victims. And if we want to protect those victims from being victimized, the thing to do is to convince the person who gets out not to continue in a life of crime. Does the gentleman from Virginia have some unanimous consent requests?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that two op-eds sponsored by Mr. Madden be entered. One is a public safety op-ed which outlined many of the things he said today, but also a very articulate article supporting the Youth Promise Act, which I enjoyed reading since I'm the chief sponsor of that legislation. Also, letter and report from the ACLU, Ending Mass Incarceration, Charting a New Justice Reinvestment, and a report from the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, State Assessment from the Urban Institute.
Without objection. If there's no further business to come before the subcommittee without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.